It was a brisk autumn evening in Fairhaven, a quiet, picturesque town nestled on the coast of Massachusetts. The town was known for its cobblestone streets lined with Victorian houses, each adorned with the warm glow of porch lights and seasonal decorations. The leaves had turned, painting the town in shades of orange, red, and gold, and they crunched under the feet of passers-by as the chill of October settled in. To the casual observer, it was an idyllic scene straight from a postcard, but behind one closed door, there was a very different reality. At the end of Maple Street stood an old weather-worn house with peeling paint and sagging shutters. This was the Johnson home, a place that once radiated laughter and warmth but now echoed with the tension of silence. Margaret Johnson, a woman whose kind eyes and patient smile had begun to fade with the weight of worry, stood at the kitchen window, her fingers clenched around the frayed hem of her apron. Her children, Lucy, an 8-year-old with golden curls and an imagination as vast as the sky, and Ben, a 5-year-old with wide, trusting eyes, played quietly on the living room floor. The air in the house felt thick, as if holding its breath. Thomas Johnson, the patriarch of the family, had once been a beloved member of the community. Tall, with a strong build and a voice that commanded respect, he was a veteran who had returned from his last tour of duty a different man. The war had left deep, invisible scars that no one could heal. He no longer told stories at the local diner or helped fix fences for neighbors. Instead, Thomas retreated into himself, his presence dark and brooding, and when the weight of his demons became too much, he lashed out. The sound of breaking glass and sharp, stinging words had become a familiar dread in the Johnson home. Margaret's life had become a careful dance of survival, shielding her children from the storm that brewed within Thomas. She woke each morning with silent prayers, hoping that the man she once loved would return to her. But each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, hope seemed to slip away with the daylight. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, there was an unsettling stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Fairhaven's narrow alleyways, a stray dog roamed. His coat was a patchwork of dark, matted fur, and his ribs showed with every shallow breath. He was nameless, a ghost among the bustling town, surviving on discarded scraps and instinct. His eyes, deep pools of amber, held a fierce intelligence that spoke of stories untold. He had seen the kind eyes of children and the rough boots of men who chased him away, but there was something in him that refused to surrender. That night, as the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the buildings, the stray felt something shift in the air. A sound carried on the breeze, a sound that made his ears twitch and his body tense. It was the sharp cry of a child, followed by a muffled thud. The dog's heartbeat quickened, and without understanding why, he moved, paws padding silently across the cold cobblestones toward the sound. The Johnson house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky, and the stray dog felt an unexplainable pull toward it. Inside the house, Margaret's heart raced as she tried to remain calm. Thomas's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the narrow hallway. The children huddled closer, sensing their mother's fear. She whispered for them to stay quiet, to stay brave. Thomas's shadow fell over the room, and the air thickened with tension. Outside, the stray reached the edge of the yard, his nose catching the scent of fear that seeped through the walls. His instincts, honed by years of survival, told him to run, to avoid the chaos of human conflict. But something else stirred in him, something stronger, a need to protect. With a determined huff, the dog pushed through the loose board of the fence and crept closer to the source of the cries. The night was about to take a turn that no one, not even the battered stray, could have anticipated. The tension in the Johnson home reached a fever pitch as Thomas's eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, fixed on Margaret. His anger, fueled by disappointment and liquor, seemed to radiate off him like heat from a furnace. Lucy and Ben, sensing the storm, clung to each other behind the worn-out couch, their small bodies trembling. Margaret tried to steady her voice as she spoke, her hands clenched at her sides. "Thomas, please. Let's just sit and talk. The children are scared." Thomas's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. His response was a slurred tirade, an avalanche of frustration that had been building for years. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as his voice grew louder. With a sudden movement, he swept a vase off the table, sending it crashing to the floor, shards scattering like stars across the worn linoleum. Lucy stifled a sob, pressing her face into Ben's hair. Outside, the stray dog, now at the side of the house, flinched at the sound of breaking glass. His eyes darted to the darkened window where shadows moved erratically. The instinct to flee warred with the strange compulsion that had brought him here. A whimper escaped his throat, but his paws held their ground. He had known hunger and cold, had faced the dangers of the streets, but the cries from within that house stirred something deep within him, a need he did not understand. Inside, Margaret stepped forward, her body a shield between Thomas and the children. She tried to reason with him, words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to reach the part of him that might still remember love. But reason was a fleeting memory in the haze of Thomas's anger. He shoved her aside, his eyes wild with pain that had long since turned to rage. Margaret fell hard against the table, gasping as the room spun. Lucy's cry broke the silence that followed, piercing the heavy air. It was the sound that reached the dog outside, sharp and full of fear. Something snapped within him. His legs moved, muscles tightening as he bounded up the rickety steps of the porch. The wood creaked under his weight, but he did not hesitate. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he pushed at the cracked door, which gave way with a reluctant groan. Thomas turned at the sound, confusion cutting through his anger for just a moment. The stray stood in the doorway, eyes locked onto the man towering over the woman and children. He was an unlikely hero, scrawny, with patches of fur missing and a body that told the tale of too many nights spent cold and hungry. But in that moment, he was formidable. His hackles rose, and a snarl, deep and fierce, vibrated through the room. Margaret's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the dog. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then Thomas roared, a sound more beast than man, and lunged forward. But the dog was faster. With a leap that defied his emaciated frame, he intercepted Thomas, teeth sinking into the fabric of his sleeve. The impact threw Thomas off balance, and he stumbled back, cursing and swinging wildly. Lucy and Ben watched with wide, tear-streaked faces as the stray clung on, refusing to release his grip even as Thomas thrashed. Margaret scrambled to her feet, rushing to the children and pulling them into her arms. She whispered hurried reassurances, her eyes never leaving the struggle between man and dog. The room seemed frozen in a battle between rage and resilience, fear and hope. Thomas managed to shake the dog off, and the stray hit the floor with a whine, his body skidding across the room. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the panting of the man and the soft whimpers of the animal. But before Thomas could advance again, the dog pushed himself up, blood staining the corner of his mouth, eyes blazing with unyielding determination. He barked, sharp and authoritative, a sound that cut through the fog in Thomas's mind. There was a shift in Thomas's eyes, something breaking beneath the weight of his own fury. He stood there, chest heaving, the echoes of the dog's growl reverberating in the quiet room. Margaret dared to hope as she saw his hands drop to his sides, fingers twitching as if unsure of their purpose. The children peered out from their mother's embrace, eyes locked on the strange, brave creature that had burst into their lives. The dog stood his ground, shoulders squared, eyes never leaving Thomas. It was as if he was saying, without words, that this was where the cycle ended. Thomas's shoulders slumped, and the room felt lighter as the tension began to dissolve, replaced by a heavy, exhausted silence. The stray dog, battered and weary, sat back on his haunches, chest heaving with effort. Margaret's eyes met his, filled with gratitude and disbelief. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the echoes of shouts and growls. Inside, a new kind of quiet settled, one that promised change. The house fell into an uneasy quiet as Thomas stood there, his chest heaving, eyes staring at the dog that had just challenged him in a way no human ever had. His hands twitched at his sides, the fury that had driven him moments before now dissolving into something else. Shame, confusion, perhaps even recognition of the monster he had become. The stray dog, still holding his ground, watched Thomas intently, the defiance in his eyes unwavering. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She dared not move, afraid that any sudden action might break the fragile ceasefire. Lucy and Ben clung to her, their small faces peeking over her arms to take in the dog that had come to their rescue. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Thomas let out a shuddering breath and dropped to his knees. The strength that anger had lent him now evaporated. His hands covered his face as he let out a sound that was part sob, part groan, a sound of a man who had reached the end of himself. The dog, sensing the shift, relaxed slightly but kept his gaze locked on Thomas. His body trembled, not with fear but with exhaustion, the fight having taken more from him than he had to give. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked from Thomas to the dog, realizing that this creature, this unlikely guardian, had broken through a barrier that she had thought impenetrable. Thomas's sobs filled the room, raw and deep, pulling the fear from its corners and replacing it with an aching sense of vulnerability. It was the first time Margaret had seen him cry since before the war, before the weight of unspeakable things had hardened him. Slowly, she stepped forward, her hands shaking, and placed them gently on his shoulders. "Thomas," she whispered, the name a fragile bridge between them. "It's over. We're here." The dog's ears twitched at her voice, and he looked at her, the fierceness in his eyes softening. Lucy and Ben, emboldened by their mother's movement, crept forward cautiously. The room felt different now, as if the very air had shifted, carrying away the fear that had suffocated it for so long. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wet. He stared at his wife and children as if seeing them for the first time in years. Guilt painted his face, but there was something else, too, an unspoken plea for forgiveness. Before he could speak, Lucy, with the boundless resilience of a child, stepped forward and placed a small, trembling hand on the dog's matted fur. The dog turned his head to look at her, the intensity in his gaze giving way to something gentler. He licked her hand, and a small, relieved smile broke across her face. Margaret exhaled, the tension in her shoulders releasing as she realized that whatever storm had raged within these walls was finally breaking. The dog, with his scarred body and fierce spirit, had not just saved them from that one night of terror, he had changed something fundamental in all of them. Thomas looked at the dog, eyes filled with something close to reverence. He reached out a hand, tentative and shaking. The dog stiffened, the instincts of a street survivor still sharp, but he did not pull away. When Thomas's hand made contact, it was as if the man was touching the very embodiment of redemption. The room, once filled with shouts and the crash of violence, now held the quiet murmurs of hope. Margaret moved to sit beside Thomas, her arm wrapping around his shoulders, grounding him in the reality of their shared pain and their shared future. The children, now fully trusting of the stray that had come to their rescue, nestled against him, finding warmth and safety in the most unexpected of protectors. Thomas's voice, hoarse and broken, cut through the silence. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Margaret squeezed his shoulder, her own tears falling freely. "We'll find a way, Thomas. We'll heal." Outside, the wind continued to rustle the trees, but it no longer carried the cold sting of foreboding. Instead, it whispered of new beginnings. The dog, now lying down, his head resting on his paws, closed his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something more than the need to survive. He felt that he had a place, however small, in a world that had so often turned its back on him. And as the night deepened, the house at the end of Maple Street stood no longer as a symbol of fear, but as a beacon of something fragile and beautiful, hope. In the days that followed that fateful night, the Johnson house was no longer filled with the suffocating tension that had once been its hallmark. The morning light seemed to find new ways to seep through the cracked blinds, illuminating corners that had long been shrouded in shadow. The stray dog, who had burst into their lives like a whirlwind, now rested comfortably on an old blanket that Margaret had laid out for him by the fireplace. His eyes, once guarded and fierce, now shone with a cautious contentment. Thomas's transformation was not instantaneous, but it was real. The outpouring of emotions that had broken through that night left him raw and vulnerable. He avoided the bottle that had once been his companion, choosing instead to spend long, quiet hours in the yard, repairing the broken fence and mending the squeaky porch steps with hands that trembled not from anger but from effort and resolve. Each swing of the hammer was an apology, a silent vow to become the man he once was. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window, a cautious hope fluttering in her chest. She had lived too many years on the edge of fear to trust easily, but there was a shift in Thomas's eyes, a gentleness that had been absent for far too long. The children, sensing the changes in their father, approached him slowly at first. Lucy would sit at the edge of the porch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, stealing glances at her father as he worked. Ben would bring him small toys, placing them by his side as if to silently offer companionship. But the true bridge between Thomas and his family was the dog. It was as if the animal sensed the unspoken battles waging inside the man. He would trot over to Thomas, sit by his side, and lean into him just enough to let him know he was there. It was a simple act, but it anchored Thomas in the present, kept him tethered to the promise he had made to himself and to his family. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the yard in hues of amber and rose, Thomas sat on the steps, his calloused hands resting on his knees. The dog, now named Guardian by Lucy, sat beside him, eyes half closed as if soaking in the warmth of the moment. Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing over the dog's ears. "Thank you," he whispered, the words so soft they almost dissolved into the breeze. Guardian's tail thumped once in response, as if acknowledging the gratitude. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her apron still tied around her waist. She carried a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade, setting it down on the rickety table. "How's the fence coming?" she asked, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time in years, there was no defensiveness in his gaze. "It's almost done," he replied, his voice steady, though tinged with the weight of all that remained unsaid. Lucy and Ben tumbled out behind their mother, laughter spilling into the quiet of the yard. They raced to Guardian, who greeted them with a wagging tail and playful nips. Their giggles wrapped around the family like a balm, easing the remnants of tension that still lingered. Margaret watched them, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and relief. She turned her gaze back to Thomas, who was watching the children with an expression that was both wistful and determined. Days turned into weeks, and the Johnson home continued to heal. The cracks in the walls were patched, but more importantly, the emotional fractures that had splintered them apart were mending. Thomas began attending counseling sessions at the local veterans center, urged on by Margaret's gentle encouragement and the unwavering support of his family. He spoke in halting sentences about the memories that haunted him, about the anger that had taken root in his soul. And slowly, he began to reclaim pieces of himself that he thought had been lost forever. Guardian became a fixture not just in their home but in the community. Neighbors who had once exchanged worried glances at the mention of the Johnsons now smiled when they saw the children walking to the park, Guardian trotting beside them with a proud, protective air. He was no longer the stray that scavenged in alleyways, but a beloved member of the family and a quiet hero to all who knew their story. One afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch steps next to Thomas. The children's laughter rang out from the backyard, where they played with Guardian, who barked happily as he chased after them. Margaret reached over and took Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. He turned to her, the lines on his face deep but softened. "I wouldn't be here without him," Thomas said, nodding toward Guardian, who was now rolling on his back, paws flailing as Lucy giggled beside him. Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Neither would we," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. They sat there, hands entwined, watching their children and the dog who had saved them all. It was a moment that spoke of second chances and the power of unexpected saviors. Guardian, sensing their gaze, lifted his head and met their eyes. For just a moment, it seemed as if he understood the weight of what he had done, the lives he had touched. He barked once, a joyful sound that echoed through the yard and out into the quiet streets of Fairhaven, where whispers of the brave dog's deeds were now told with reverence. As the first chill of winter swept through Fairhaven, the Johnson family gathered around the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a golden glow across the room. Guardian lay at Margaret's feet, his eyes half closed, contentment radiating from his tired body. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol of resilience and hope, not just for the Johnsons, but for anyone who had heard their story. Thomas sat with Lucy on his lap, his arms wrapped securely around her as Ben played with wooden blocks nearby. The lines of tension that had once creased Thomas's face were softer now, replaced with a quiet determination. Margaret glanced at her family, her heart swelling with a peace she hadn't known in years. It was not the end of their struggles. Healing was a path they would walk together for years to come, but it was the beginning of something new, something whole. Guardian lifted his head, ears perking at the sound of the wind outside. He looked at Margaret, who smiled and reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You saved us," she said, her voice warm and full of gratitude. The dog's tail wagged lazily, as if to acknowledge her words. As the fire crackled and laughter filled the room, Guardian rested his head back on his paws, eyes closing with the comfort of knowing he was home. The once stray dog had found his place not just as a protector, but as a part of a family rebuilt from love, resilience, and second chances. And in the quiet, cozy room, surrounded by the family he had saved, Guardian's story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes come from the most unexpected places. The Johnson home, now filled with light and laughter, stood as a testament to the power of change, of redemption, and of the unwavering bond between humans and the animals who touched their lives. And as the night deepened, Guardian slept, content and loved, knowing that his journey had led him exactly where he was meant to be. It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.